Okay, guys, we're back. I'm looking at Socrates and Phaedrus some more. Um, Hope you guys are doing okay out there in crazy COVID America and everybody's staying safe. And I know it's difficult and ridiculous, and it's not, this is a bad situation, obviously. But I appreciate you guys even showing up. I got a question recently from a student who was wondering if they were like, "Oh, is it okay if I comment on old blog? Like, is it too late to comment?" Like, no, it's never too late to comment. Um, the whole reason I did this because I knew people were going to be busy and people were going to have chaotic lives, and so I figured if I did it like this, you can get on there whenever you want and read the blogs. So you could, if there's something from 2 weeks ago and you're just getting to it now, please put a comment at the bottom, and that way I know you're alive. And also I get an email in my mailbox every time you comment. I get a little email, so hopefully then I go right to your comment and I say something in response to you. I'm trying to respond to all the students, so feel free to do that, please. I would appreciate it. So I'm gonna I don't, it's a crazy time in the world, and obviously everything's nuts. But I don't know what else to do other than to kind of keep going with what I've been doing. So, let's do it. Um, so we return. I'm on page 19 of the Phaedrus, but we're making very good progress through this thing, by the way. On page 19 of the Phaedrus, and Socrates and Phaedrus. It's a little annoying because I have trouble sort of turning the page easily. Um, but Socrates and Phaedrus were discussing a person who they're saying, well, you have to be an expert at something. Um, and that's because Socrates wants words, that's discourse, that's speeches and writing. He wants them anchored to philosophy, anchored to truth, the search for larger truths, and not just like a bag of tricks and sneaky stuff that con artists use to get what they want or to influence opinion, but rather to use words in the search for truth. And one of the things Socrates says at the bottom of 18 and the beginning of 19 is they talk about a person who, just because you know what some drugs will do sometimes, does not make you a doctor. And in the same way, just because you know that certain drugs will have certain effects on certain people at certain times, and you know some stuff about a handful of drugs, it's not the same thing as being a doctor. And Socrates thinks that's the same thing as these people who use words to manipulate, to trick people, to convince people, to argue for crazy things. That doesn't make you a philosopher, because it's a bag of tricks, but it's not the same thing. And so they discuss that, and they discuss the example at the bottom of 18, the top of 19. I'm currently on 19. Um, um, right? They're talking about this person who imagines they're a doctor. And what would we say to that person? Well, they would simply say that he's a madman or a pedant who fancies that he is a physician because he has read something in a book or has stumbled upon a prescription or two, although he has no real understanding of the art of medicine. Right? So a person who just knew a couple of drugs, you wouldn't confuse a person who knows something about drugs with a doctor who is a larger kind of professional. Um, and so Socrates wants to use this as a jumping off point to think about the writing. And this idea about, you wouldn't think they're a doctor, right? You'd think they were like a crazy person or a person who imagines he is a doctor because he has read something in a book. And this connects to the issue of writing getting in the wrong hands, which is something that's going to become important later on in the piece. So remember that moment, right? Just because you read something in a book doesn't make you a doctor. Just because you went to WebMD and looked shit up on the internet does not make you qualified to diagnose shit. Um, so, uh, so Socrates goes on to another example, right? And um, and suppose a person were to come to Sophocles or Euripides. Sophocles and Euripides, they write tragedy. They write plays, tragic plays. Sophocles wrote Oedipus Rex, if you've ever heard of the Oedipus complex, or it's called Oedipus the King, if you've ever heard of Antigone. That's these guys. And suppose a person were to come to Sophocles or Euripides and say that he knows how to make a very long speech about a small matter, and a short speech about a great matter, and also a sorrowful speech, or a terrible or a threatening speech, or any other kind of speech. And in teaching this, fancies, imagines that he is teaching the art of tragedy. Well, they would surely laugh at him if he imagines that tragedy is anything but the arranging of these elements into a manner which will be suitable to one another and the whole, right? Um, so this is a simple example. Is talking about ancient Greek plays, right? Just because you know how to write a speech is not the same thing as knowing how to be a great theater writer. Just because you know how to do a couple of punching and kicking does not qualify you to film, to star in the next big martial arts movie, right? Because some little pieces, right? Just because you know how to make a speech doesn't make you into William Shakespeare. Just because you know something about how a couple of drugs works doesn't make you into a professional doctor. Um, and the same thing with writing. Just because you know how to convince people of some stuff doesn't really make you like a thinker, like a proper philosopher, just because you know some of the tricks. So Socrates says, um, they would laugh at him if you said you knew what you were doing. He says, but I do not suppose they would be rude or abusive to him. Would they not treat him as a musician would, a man who thinks he is a harmonist because he knows how to pitch the highest and the lowest notes? Happening to meet such a one, would he not say to him savagely, "Fool, you are mad"? But like a musician, in gentle and harmonious tone of voice, he would answer, "My good friend, he who would be a harmonist must certainly know this, and yet he may understand nothing of harmony if he has not got beyond your stage of knowledge, for you only know the preliminaries of harmony and not harmony itself." Very true. So he says, listen, certainly people could be mean. You could say, just because you know something about how a drug works doesn't make you a doctor. Just because you know something about how to make a speech doesn't make you into a playwright. Just because you know how to film something with a YouTube camera does not make me qualified to film the next Best Picture winner. It doesn't make knowing how to use this camera and a stick does not make me into a professional movie director. But Socrates is actually pretty nice here. He says, listen, but the person's not wrong. It is true. You do need to know, like, in order to film a movie, you need to know how cameras work and how they operate and things like camera angles and stuff. And I know a couple of things about that. Listen, you're on your way, but you're not there yet. Knowing something about a drug is part of being a doctor. Knowing something about camera work is part of being a film director. Knowing something about pitch is part of being a professional musician. Knowing something about speeches is part of being a playwright or a screenwriter. And so he says, listen, it is true that you need these things, but that's just the beginning. You're only at the beginning stages of knowledge. And Socrates it's very important to him that you don't confuse the very beginning, the lowest stages of knowledge, the beginning of knowledge, with the end of knowledge, which is right. There's a difference between being a freshman in college and being a professor. There's a difference between being a middle school student and being a high school student, right? There are these kind of rankings, and he wants to make sure that yes, you're on your way. You're learning things you need to know, but you're not quite there yet. So let's take a look at this a little bit more. So he says, and will not Sophocles, that's the guy who writes plays, and will not Sophocles say to the display of the would-be tragedian that this is not tragedy, but the preliminaries of tragedy, it's the beginnings of tragedy? And will not Acumenus say the same of medicine to the would-be physician, right? They only have the beginning of it. Oh boy, looks like we got a bunch of names coming up. And if Adrastus the mellifluous or Pericles heard of these wonderful arts, brachiologies or iconologies, and all the hard names which we have been endeavoring to draw into the light of day, what would they say? Instead of losing temper and applying uncomplimentary epithets, instead of saying bad things, as you and I have been doing, the authors of such imaginary, sorry, it's hard to read this. The authors of such Oh boy, I've completely lost this. The authors of such imaginary art, their superior wisdom, would rather censure us as well as them. Have a little patience, Phaedrus and Socrates. They would say, you should not be in such a passion with those from whom a want of dialectical skill, that's talking, are unable to define the nature of rhetoric, and consequently suppose they had found the art in the preliminary conditions of it, and when these have been taught to them by others, fancy that the whole art of rhetoric has been taught to them. But as to the using of several instruments of the art effectively, or making the composition of a whole, an application such as this they disregard as an easy thing which their disciples may make for themselves. So, this is a little overly complicated for us, so we probably don't need the whole paragraph. But the point here is that, look, these people who teach you how to, people like Lysias, who know how to convince an audience to agree with them, that's part of it. But it's only part. It's the preliminaries. It's here the pre and preliminary. It's liminary is the line. It means just the beginning of the line. Preliminary. It's just getting started. So these people who Lysias knows how to do speeches, it's not that he's like a complete, worthless person, but he only has part of the story, because convincing people and speaking clearly is only part. You also have to know the truth. All right, see you in the next video.